So here's the thing. Economics is broken. What do I mean by broken? Well, it simply can't answer the big economic questions that we all want answers to. Perhaps the biggest economic question is, how do we get economic growth in an economy? Everybody wants growth. It's the way to improve living standards, to push the economy forwards. Now, if you ask an economist, they may give you a prescription, but is it based on some standard economic model? Is it therefore grounded in reality? The answer is no. Economic models don't tell us how to get growth. So why? What is the point of a model that can't answer the most basic questions? And that's not the only one it can't answer. How about recessions? Economies tend to grow over time, but every so often they fall into recessions. We don't want recessions. How do we avoid them? Well, in order to know that, we need to know what causes them in the first place. What do economic models tell us about what causes recessions? The answer is nothing at all. In fact, economists tend to assume that recessions are caused by random events outside of anyone's control, hitting the economy and pushing it into a recession. It's a bit like an asteroid hitting the Earth and killing the dinosaurs. It's not a scientific explanation in the sense that it's completely unpredictable. It just relies on some godlike events happening. And in any case, once one of these events has happened, why should the economy recover and get back to a growth path? All of this completely unexplained by current economic models. And if you've got a recession, what should you do to get out of it? Well, you can ask economists and you'll get two completely opposed schools of thought. One says the government should spend a lot of its money to boost the economy, and the other says the government should stop spending money, institute austerity, in order to get spend back in line with the state of the economy at the moment. Which of these is right? Well, economics doesn't tell you, and neither of those prescriptions come from any standard economic model that can be used to say what to do. How about inflation? Governments are always worried about inflation. They want to keep it down. At the moment, most central banks seem to have a target of around 2% as being a good rate of inflation. But why should it be 2%? Why shouldn't it be 0% or 5%, minus 2%? Again, none of this comes from any standard economic model. It's left up to bank governors or politicians to make this decision. That's not great. And if you've got inflation and you want to bring it down, what should you do? Well, at the moment, the standard prescription is that interest rates are pushed up. If you push up interest rates, people can't borrow so much. They've got to pay back more on the borrowings they already have. This reduces the amount of money being spent in the economy and damages it. So you're damaging the economy, and eventually that probably will bring inflation down, but at a big cost. Is that a good thing to do? Economics doesn't tell you. And in any case, there are other things governments could do. They could raise taxes. That would also take money out of the economy. They don't tend to do that, but they could. Why not? Who knows? Or they could, as they sometimes do, try to restrain wages. They should try to keep the rate of increase of wages below the rate of inflation. Again, a good thing, a bad thing? Economics doesn't tell you. And the final set of big questions are around debt and savings. Is debt a bad thing? It tends to be painted as a bad thing, but it's been around for as long as economic history exists, so people seem to need it and to find it useful. And the opposite side of this coin is savings. Are savings good? They sort of sound morally good, and if you save, you personally are buffered against any unexpected events. But if people save, that means there's less money being spent in the economy and the whole economy will contract. So is savings good? Is it bad? And if you're in a situation where you've got too much debt, what should you do about it? You can print money as a government to try to boost the economy, or nowadays we call this quantitative easing, which just means giving the money to banks rather than to people as a whole, or you can decide to cut down on spending. We're back in austerity again. Again, what you do is not guided by any standard economic models. Now, you don't have to take my word for this absence of economic guidance from the economics profession. Here's a couple of Nobel Prize-winning economists giving a press conference and being asked the question about how does economics help in these big questions.
How can we actually support the economy, create jobs? You know, those questions everybody are asking themselves.
I think part of the point of this prize and questions like that require careful thinking, a lot of data analysis, and that the answers are not likely to be simple. So that asking Tom and me for answers off the top of our heads to these questions is, you shouldn't expect much from us.
So why is it that standard economic models can't answer these big questions, can't explain really how the economy works? Well, the first thing is that they're designed not to answer these questions. The basis of these models is that the economy should be going along in a reasonably stable, steady pattern. A few ups and downs around that, but reasonably stable. In fact, economists are always looking for what they call equilibrium solutions. But the big questions are not about steady states. They're not about equilibrium. They're about dynamics of an economic system. They're about the big rises in productivity, in growth, in spending, and they're about the big decreases in spending, in growth, and large increases in inflation. They're not about steady state. They're about the good and the bad things that can happen well away from any stable economic situation. So the models simply aren't designed to answer those questions. But it's worse than that, because even given what they're designed for, they're based on batshit crazy assumptions. Effectively, they assume that everyone in an economy has a crystal ball, and that crystal ball can tell them the future. Oh, and by the way, all the crystal balls are aligned, so they all get told the same future. And knowing precisely what's going to happen in the future, they will then carefully plan out, I assume using a spreadsheet, exactly how much they're going to spend and what they're going to spend it on for the rest of their lives, so that by the time they come to their deathbed, they will have maximized their total human happiness over their lifespan. Now, first of all, it's quite obvious that we can't see the future. All you need to do is try gambling on the stock market for a few weeks to convince yourself of that. And even if we could see the future in detail, it's very unlikely that anybody would do these complicated calculations about their net total happiness over their life. People make all sorts of quick decisions based on what their friends are doing, what information's come to them recently. They're as much random as rational. So we have models not designed to answer the big questions and that are based on crazy assumptions about how people behave. And finally, not only that, but these models have become so mathematical that they're extremely difficult to explain to anybody outside of the economics profession. If you open an economics paper, not that I advise it, you'll get taught about transition matrices and Hilbert spaces and various mathematical entities that really have got nothing to do with the everyday business of how an economy runs. And this extreme mathematization means that we're really dealing with a sort of religion. It's become so complicated that only people inside understand all the details, and therefore they can act as a form of priesthood with their own truths which people outside are unable to examine or to attack. Good for them, bad for economics, bad for a country. So, if we have this situation where standard economic models are designed for the wrong purpose, based on the wrong assumptions, and completely unintelligible, where do we go from here? Well, the answer would seem to be we should put together from the ground up a new economic model, and that economic model should be as simple as possible, based on realistic behaviours, and designed to show the dynamics of economic systems, the real big ups and downs, not only deal with stable economies. And that's what we're going to try and do in this series of videos, where we'll first examine what are the basic elements we need in such models, and then put together a model and see how it can start to answer some of the questions, some of the big economic questions that we've been referring to. So here's a preview of the sort of model we'd like to achieve. This is an extremely simplified economy with just one set of workers and one set of firm owners interacting together with the central bank to develop the economy. And in this case, you'll be able to see that the economy develops from time zero, where there was no activity, up until now, where you can see that the economy grows for a period, and we can see this happening in real time, and then every so often there is a contraction so that the economy falls back down again. So this sort of model shows far more realistic behaviour with the business cycle, the ups and downs of everyday economic activity, than the standard existing economic models. This is what we want to achieve, and of course we can introduce far more elements and make it far more complicated to be a more realistic representation of actual economies. Let's look at the charges I made about economics not helping with the big questions in some real examples. The two most influential economists in history have been Adam Smith and John Keynes, and they both came from the United Kingdom. So let's use the UK as an example. We'll take its performance over the past 20 years. Now, at the moment, we can see that public services are in crisis, we have high public debt, low growth, workers are worse off than they have been since over the past 20 years. There seems to have been a series of dreadful economic decisions backed up by unhelpful economic advice. In fact, there have been three major economic events to look at over the past 20 years, and those have been the financial crisis of 2007-2008, Brexit, and COVID. If we look at the performance of the economy over this period, you can see that the GDP figures reflect significant dips at the time of the financial crisis, 2008, and for COVID. They don't, however, reflect any immediate response to Brexit. And we can look at these also in terms of percentage change in GDP growth, giving a similar picture. If we look at wage figures over this period, we can see that in fact they've been roughly stagnant, but in fact there's been a slight decline over the past 20 years. This is in contrast to the GDP figures actually increasing over that period. So let's look first at the earliest of these three economic events, the 2007-2008 financial crisis. Economists completely failed to see this financial crisis coming, and their models couldn't explain it after it had arrived. Before the crisis, in fact back in 2003, a famous economist, Robert Lucas, who was president of the American Economic Association, declared the central problem of depression prevention has been solved for all practical purposes and has in fact been solved for many decades. This proved to be a little optimistic when that financial crisis then hit a few years later, and spent the economy into a definite depression. Economics also failed to provide any clear answer as to why a financial crisis, affecting in the first place banks, should then spread to affect the real economy, that is the rest of the economy that's not banks, so badly. In fact, after this crisis hit, economic activity declined over half of the countries in the world. That's a very big hit to the world economy. How was it that it was transmitted from a banking problem to a worldwide economic problem? I mean, there are a couple of potential reasons. One of them is simply that the banks were not lending so much, and this therefore meant that normal businesses couldn't get credit, and this affected their business performance. Another proposal is that it simply affected the general confidence level of people in the world, and they all withdrew their horns a little, stopped spending to be on the safe side. But again, there was no clear explanation given by economics. Once the financial crisis had hit, the question was, of course, how to recover from it. And economists were again pretty unhelpful. They in fact gave a lot of intellectual cover to governments that were very much inclined to cut spending and to introduce austerity, which is what they actually did in many cases, and in particular in the UK. So in 2010, a couple of economists, Reinhardt and Rogoff, wrote a paper, Growth in a Time of Debt, and this argued from their data analysis that any country with a debt to GDP ratio which was higher than 90%, i.e. they had a fairly high level of debt, would grow more slowly than countries below that 90% figure. It later turned out that they'd analysed the data completely wrongly and this wasn't a real result, but it gave cover for governments to say, hey, we've got high levels of debt, we're going to grow slowly, therefore the sensible thing to do is to cut those levels of debt by cutting spending. And that's what George Osborne, in charge of the financial side of the UK, did in his 2010 budget.
But the sense I get from the British people is they know we have a problem. They know we have too much debt. They know that our deficit is unsustainable. And
many people look at Britain as a test case of too much austerity too soon.
Well, I don't agree with that analysis, and I guess that would surprise you.
He imposed austerity measures with a 40 billion package of emergency tax increases, welfare cuts, government spending restraint. All of that was designed to cut the UK's debt. Taxes on purchases, value-added tax, rose from 17.5% to 20%, capital gains tax went up, there was a 2-year public sector pay freeze, welfare benefits were slashed, and at the same time there was a cut in corporation tax in order to help businesses. So he did all that because there was a sort of underlying view that if you cut government spending, you'll give more confidence to investors in the bond market so that they will be willing to buy government bonds at a lower rate of interest. That lower rate of interest will then feed through into general interest rates within the economy, and those lower interest rates and the lower borrowing costs they mean will improve confidence for businesses and consumers to borrow and go out and spend, and therefore the economy will improve and we'll get back to growth. It's a fairly vague argument, it's not based on any real economic model, but that seems to be the basis of the thinking. What did economists make of this austerity plan? Did they approve it? Did they disapprove it? Well, the ratings agency Fitch said the budget would materially strengthen confidence in the country's public finances, and the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development said that praised Osborne for his courage in this budget. So there we are, economics support for the austerity budget. Well, what actually happened? Unemployment rose, wages dropped, productivity stagnated. Pretty much a disaster. So what did economists say after the financial crisis and after the austerity budget? The lack of wage growth at the aggregate level remains a mystery, said a US economist at the Bank of America Merrill Lynch, i.e., nobody really understood why these economic measures had not produced the effects they were supposed to. Now let's look at Brexit. Brexit happened in 2016. The UK voted to leave the EU, and the EU was, of course, its biggest trading partner, so that was almost bound to cause a difficulty in trading relationships. What were the arguments then in favour of leaving the EU, apart from the political one of having independence? Well, the ones that put forward by the Leave campaign, in particular Boris Johnson, who was essentially leading it, were that, first of all, the UK is a great country and therefore it's going to succeed, whatever its economic position in the world happens to be. And secondly, that by reducing the availability of foreign workers who could work for low wages, we would arrive in the UK at a higher wage economy, so everybody would be better off.
And that is the direction in which this country is going now, towards a high wage, high skill, high productivity, and yes, thereby a low tax economy.
These arguments are, in fact, pretty tenuous, and what did economists actually say in response to them? Well, most predicted that if we left, there would be an immediate hit to the economy, essentially a recession. The Bank of England said that Brexit could lead to a significant depreciation of the pound, which eventually it did, and a recession. The International Monetary Fund predicted that Brexit would cause reduced investment and another immediate decline in economic growth. So these are pretty catastrophic warnings from the economist profession. What did politicians say in response to those warnings?
The truth is that if we vote to leave, we'll be in an economically stronger position.
Well, Boris Johnson, on being advised that business was generally worried about the prospect of leaving, said, fuck business. Essentially, he meant fuck economics. And his deputy, Michael Gove, again referring to these economic experts, said, we've all had enough of experts. Well, what actually happened? The UK did vote to leave the EU, and in 2023 an independent study by Cambridge Econometrics assessed that as a result, by 2023, the UK had 1.8 million fewer jobs than it would have done, that the size of the economy had shrunk by approximately 6% compared to what it would have been if we hadn't left, and that the average Briton is about £2,000 a year worse off than if we hadn't left. So, in fact, a pretty disastrous outcome. But while there was an immediate hit to the value of the pound, as predicted, the effect of Brexit did not include an immediate recession. What actually has happened is that the effect has been gradual over a number of years, and essentially it's impacted the rate of growth, not the absolute level, in the sense that the growth has not become negative. We haven't entered into a recession. So on that side, the economists were actually wrong. Finally, let's look at the mini-budget instituted by Liz Truss, who had become the new Prime Minister in 2022. She was faced with a situation where since COVID, the UK economy had been pretty stagnant, and she was determined to try and get some growth. So she attempted to jumpstart growth by tax cuts to businesses and the richer portion of society.
What I don't accept is the idea that tax cuts on business don't help people in general. Of course they help people in general.
What did the economists say about this approach? Well, they were all pretty sceptical. The Institute for Financial Studies said the plan seems to be to borrow large sums at increasingly expensive rates, put government debt on an unsustainable rising path, and hope that we get better growth. Again, a pretty damning indictment of these policies. And indeed, that turned out to be how the market saw it. The market saw this approach as extremely high risk, and they put a price on it. UK 10-year government bond yields had been about 3%. That's essentially the amount the government has to pay in order to get people to invest in the country. As the mini-budget came out, those yields went up over 4%, and the pound dropped in value by 20%. That increase in the bond yields pushed up mortgage rates, and the housing market more or less froze. Nobody could afford to move, and pension funds turned out to be on the risk of collapse. The Bank of England had to intervene, markets panicked, and all of these policies had to be more or less immediately reversed, and Miss Truss resigned. After all that, their rough assessment was that the cost of this debacle was about 30 billion to the UK economy. So, in this case, the expert economic views were pretty much right, but they were ignored. And they were ignored because Liz Truss wanted growth, a very reasonable desire, and yet economists really don't have an answer as to how to get it. As Liz Truss said, there was an orthodoxy in Britain about economic policy, and I tried to challenge that orthodoxy. And in that, at least, she was right. So from this look at economic situation in the UK over the past 20 years, we can see that we've had a series of disastrous responses, really, to economic situations. They were political responses, but they were either supported by inaccurate economic models, or economic model advice was ignored because economics doesn't seem able to answer the big questions that politicians naturally want the answers to. In either case, economics has failed. It doesn't have a basic model of the economy that can provide the answers to the big questions. And this situation isn't unique to the United Kingdom. It may be particularly pronounced in the United Kingdom, but if we look, for example, at this graph of the last 25 years of economic growth in the United States, a relatively successful economy, we can see that they have still regular recessions. Those business cycles continue to appear, and often there are periods of pretty poor growth. So economics has failed in its main task, which is to guide politicians and central banks to put in place policies that promote growth and prevent recessions. It may have many other tasks that economists spend their time looking at, and they may be of considerable technical interest, but they're secondary. The thing we need to do is to find economics which works for those big questions. In summary, economics can't answer the big economic questions, and because it can't, politicians feel free to ignore it or to cherry-pick bits of advice which happen to suit their own ideologies. This is really not a good recipe. What's the direction then that we need to take in economics? 3 principles stand out. First, we need to design a dynamic model, a model that can cope with big surges, big recessions in the economy, not one that assumes a fundamentally stable equilibrium state. Current ones simply aren't designed to allow for business cycles. Secondly, we need a model that's based on real behaviour, not on weird assumptions about crystal balls, complete rationality. We need to get rid of all that and base models on actual, simple rules of behaviour. third and finally, we need a simple model, one that only contains the essential features that are necessary to model the major upturns and downturns of an economy. We don't need models with thousands of equations. We need models with a few equations that actually work. So before starting to develop a new model, which is what we'll be doing in this series, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. So the next video, the failure of current economic models, will examine the current standard economic models in more detail. We want to solidify the argument that they need to be replaced, and we're going to look at who in economics is brave enough to point out the problems with them and why those problems haven't yet been fixed.